Boker Tov. 7 years ago, when missiles were flying back and forth between Gaza and Israel for 50 days, my closest neighbors here in Cambridge, an Israeli man and a Jewish American woman, were in Haifa. And I would check in with them regularly just to see how they were doing. For my American friend, it was terrifying, and it would take years before she could feel any sense of safety again in Israel. And for my Israeli friend, it was also terrifying, but in a familiar way, from a life well worn by the repetitive trauma of his homeland. What was perhaps more disturbing was that I was one of his few American friends to check in on him, and he was drowning in a barrage of anti-Israel sentiment from some of his regular media sources. Now, I should let you know that I'm pretty much a dyed-in-the-wool progressive. I first learned about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in college from some high-ranking academics in the PLO, and for most of my life, I've bought into the knee-jerk left-leaning narrative of Israel mean, bad, and powerful, and Palestinians good, vulnerable, and oppressed. And I admit that I think there's some truth in that narrative, but it's not the whole truth. The year after my friend's trauma under the Gaza-Israeli 50-day conflagration, I traveled to Israel as a guest of the trips that Nami just defined, and it was complexifying to say the least. I learned for the first time about the distinctions between Hamas, Fatah, and Hezbollah, and how they are often in conflict with one another. I met an Arab-Israeli activist named Mohammed, who is the 27th of his generation in an Arab village in Israel, who is one of the most effective social change agents I've ever met, building true institutional equity for thousands of the country's second-class citizens. I met a tour guide named Yishai who loves his country, knows its history backwards and forwards, which is surely part of the why he makes sure his kids go to the hand-in-hand school so they learn side by side with Arab kids. I watched as Shira Banki, a 16-year-old activist, much like my own Jewish American niece here in Jamaica Plain, was stabbed to death before my very eyes at Jerusalem's Gay Pride Parade by an ultra-Orthodox man who'd just been released from prison. I met Arab Palestinians in the West Bank who said that boycott, divest, sanction has detrimental economic effects for them. I met Palestinian Christians, much more devout than I. I met an outspoken Zionist named Eve who believes she has a biblical right to the land and her soldiers' sons are part of America's best defense shield against terrorism. I met Somali and Ethiopian Jews who have trouble being accepted into the culture because of the color of their skin. And I heard my African-American traveling companions murmur, "It's the same damn thing." I stayed in an Airbnb apartment with a wheeler-dealer young entrepreneur in Tel Aviv who has little interest in politics. And I met Israelis in a farm cooperative near the Gazan border who used to have friendly relations with their Gazan neighbors and now cannot even get in touch with them. So I'm dismayed when I watch my favorite news program. The only Israeli voice I hear is Benjamin Netanyahu. I turned to my partner and I said, how would we feel if Donald Trump or Mitch McConnell or even Joe Biden were the only American to represent what we think about racism, mass incarceration, gun violence, or immigration? Now, I should say that I'm a progressive because I believe it's what the bleeding heart radical rabbi Jesus of Nazareth calls me to be. And I learned that down the street in my Sunday school from Harry Truman's house, the first American president to recognize Israel. Jesus calls me to do crazy, counterintuitive things like love my neighbor, love my enemies, bless those who persecute me. He calls me to look beyond labels like tax collector, prostitute, and Pharisee, as well as black, white, hawk, dove, Jew, Arab, Israeli, Palestinian, progressive, conservative, and get to know people as truly beloved children of God made in God's image. In Israel and Palestine, I met people caught up in a situation not entirely of their own making, very much like the oppressive systems that my own Americans take part in this country. I met people who've lost faith in their leaders, people who are trying to live and love with integrity and safety in their own private lives within a messy and often dysfunctional democracy, and I care about them. From my privileged white American position of security, I can only imagine the kind of pain, terror, and trauma people are experiencing on both sides of the divide. And I continue to pray in solidarity with those who can get past the cynical business of politics as usual and keep lighting the torches of love, justice, democracy, and peace. Toda Rabah and Shabbat Shalom.